In his telegram, Mr. Roosevelt expresses the belief that every major war, even if it were confined to other continents, must have serious consequences, not only while it lasts, but for generations to come. Answer: no one knows this better than the German people. For the peace treaty of Versailles imposed burdens on the German people which could not have been paid off in 100 years, although it has been proved conclusively by American teachers of constitutional law, historians, and professors of history that Germany was no more to blame for the outbreak of the war than any other nation. But I do not believe that every conflict need have disastrous consequences for the whole world, literally the whole of mankind, provided that it is not systematically drawn into such conflicts by the obligations of a network of nebulous pacts. For since in the past centuries, and as I pointed out at the beginning of my answer, in the course of the last decades also, the world has experienced a continuous series of wars. If Mr. Roosevelt's assumption were correct, the sum total of the outcome of all these wars would have already imposed a burden on humanity, which it would have to bear for millions of years to come. Mr. Roosevelt declared that he had already appealed to me on a former occasion for a peaceful settlement of political, economic, and social problems without resort to arms. Answer: I myself have always been an exponent of this view, and as history proves, have settled necessary political, economic, and social problems without force of arms, without even resorting to arms. Unfortunately, however, this peaceful settlement has been made more difficult by the agitation of politicians, statesmen, and newspaper representatives who were neither directly concerned nor even affected by the problems in question. Mr. Roosevelt believes that the tide of events is once more bringing the threat of arms with it, and that if this threat continues, a large part of the world is condemned to common ruin. Answer: as far as Germany is concerned, I know nothing of this kind of threat to other nations, although I read lies about such a threat every day in the democratic newspapers. Every day I read of German mobilizations, of the landing of troops, of extortions. All this in connection with states with whom we are not only living absolutely peacefully, but with whom we are also, in many cases, the closest friends. Mr. Roosevelt believes further that in case of war, victorious, vanquished, and neutral nations will all suffer alike. Answer: in the course of my political activity, I have been the exponent of this conviction for 20 years, at a time when responsible statesmen in America, unfortunately, could not bring themselves to make the same admission as regards their participation in the Great War and its issue. Mr. Roosevelt believes that in the end it lies with the leaders of the great nations to preserve their peoples from the impending disaster. Answer: if that is true, then it is culpable neglect, not to use a stronger word, if the leaders of nations in authority fail to control their newspapers which agitate for war, and thus save the world from the threatening calamity of an armed conflict. I cannot understand further why these responsible leaders, instead of cultivating diplomatic relations between nations, make them more difficult and indeed disturb them by such actions as the recall of ambassadors without any reason. Mr. Roosevelt declared finally that 3 nations in Europe and 1 in Africa have seen their independent existence terminated. Answer: I do not know which 3 nations in Europe are meant. Should it be a question of the provinces reincorporated in the German Reich, I must draw the attention of Mr. Roosevelt to a mistake in history on his part. It was not now that these nations sacrificed their independent existence in Europe, but rather in 1918. At that time, in violation of solemn promises, their logical ties were torn asunder, and they were made into the nations which they never wished to be and never had been. They were forced into an independence which was no independence, but at most could only mean dependence upon an international foreign world which they detested. Moreover, as to the allegations that 1 nation in Africa has lost its freedom, that, too, is erroneous. It is not a question of one nation in Africa having lost its freedom. On the contrary, practically all the original inhabitants of this continent have lost their freedom through being made subject to the sovereignty of other nations by bloodshed and force. Moroccans, Berbers, Arabs, Negroes, and the rest have all fallen victim to the swords of foreign might, which, however, were not marked made in Germany, but made by democracies. Mr. Roosevelt then speaks of the reports which he admittedly does not believe to be correct, but which state that still further acts of aggression are contemplated against other independent nations. Answer: I consider every such unfounded insinuation as an attempt against the tranquility and peace of the world. I also see in them an effort calculated to alarm smaller nations, or at least to put them on edge. If Mr. Roosevelt really has any specific instances in mind in this connection, I would ask him to name the states which are threatened with aggression and to name the aggressor in question. It will then be a simple matter to refute these preposterous general charges quite briefly. Mr. Roosevelt states that the world is plainly moving towards the moment when this situation must end in catastrophe unless a rational way of guiding events is found. He also declares that I have repeatedly asserted that I and the German people have no desire for war, and that if this is true, there need be no war. Answer: I should like to point out in the first place that I have not waged any war. In the second, that for years I have expressed my abhorrence of war and, no less, of warmongers. And thirdly, that I do not know for what purpose I should wage a war at all. I would appreciate if Mr. Roosevelt would give me some explanation in this regard. Mr. Roosevelt is further of the opinion that the peoples of the world could not be persuaded that any governing power has any right or need to inflict the consequences of war on its own or any other people, save in the self-evident cause of home defense. Answer: I should think that every reasonable human being is of this opinion. But it seems to me that in almost every war, both sides claim that theirs is a case of unquestionable home defense. I do not believe there is an authority in this world, including the American president himself, who could decide this question unequivocally. There is hardly any possibility of doubt, for example, that America's entry into the Great War was not a case of unquestionable home defense. A research committee set up by President Roosevelt himself has examined the causes of America's entry into the Great War and reached the conclusion that the entry ensued chiefly for reasons that were exclusively capitalistic. Nevertheless, no practical conclusions have been drawn from this fact. Let us hope then that at least the United States will in the future act according to this noble principle herself and will not go to war against any country except in the cause of unquestionable home defense. Mr. Roosevelt says further that he does not speak from selfishness, fear, or weakness, but with the voice of strength and friendship for mankind. Answer: if this voice of strength and friendship for mankind had been raised by America at the proper time, and particularly if it had had any practical value, then at least that treaty, which was to become the source of the direst derangement of humanity and history, the Dictate of Versailles, could have been prevented. Mr. Roosevelt declares further that it is clear to him that all international problems can be solved at the council table. Answer: theoretically, one ought to believe in this possibility, for common sense would correct demands, oil the one hand, and show the compelling necessity of compromise, oil the other. For example, by the logic of common sense and the general principles of a higher human justice, indeed, according to the laws of a divine will, All peoples ought to have all equal share in the world's goods. It ought not then to happen that one people needs so much space to live in that it cannot get along with 15 inhabitants to the square kilometer, while others are forced to sustain 140, 150, or even 200 on the same area. But in any event, these fortunate peoples should not curtail the existing space allotted to those who are already suffering by robbing them of their colonies. For instance, I should therefore be more than happy if these problems could really find their solution at the council table. My skepticism, however, is based on the fact that it was America herself who gave sharpest expression to her mistrust in the effectiveness of conferences. For the greatest conference of all time was, without doubt, the League of Nations. This authoritative body, representing all the peoples of the world, created in accordance with the intentions of an American president, was supposed to solve the problems of humanity at the council table. The first state, however, that shrank from this endeavor was the United States. The reason being that President Wilson himself, even then, cherished the greatest doubts of the possibility of really being able to solve decisive international problems at the conference table. We honor your well-meant expression of opinion, Mr. Roosevelt, but over against your opinion stands the actual fact that in almost 20 years of the activity of the greatest conference in the world, the League of Nations, it has proved impossible to solve one single decisive international problem. Contrary to Wilson's promise, Germany was prevented for many years by the Peace Treaty of Versailles from participating in this great world conference. In spite of the bitterest experience, there was one German government that believed that there was no need to follow the example of the United States and that it should therefore take a seat at this conference table. It was not till after years of purposeless participation that I resolved to follow the example of America and likewise leave the largest conference in the world. Since then, I have solved my people's problems, which, like all others, were unfortunately not solved at the conference table of the League of Nations, and solved them without recourse to war in any instance. Apart from this, however, as already mentioned, numerous other problems have been brought before world conferences in recent years, without any solution having been found. If, however, Mr. Roosevelt, your belief that every problem can be solved at the conference table is true, then all nations, including the United States, have been led in the past 700 or 800 years either by blind men or by criminals. For no statesman, including those of the United States, and especially her greatest, made the outstanding part of their country's history at the conference table, but by reason of the strength of their people. The freedom of North America was not achieved at the conference table any more than the conflict between the North and the South was decided there. I will not mention the innumerable struggles which finally led to the subjugation of the North American continent as a whole. I recite all this is only in order to show that your view, Mr. Roosevelt, although undoubtedly deserving of all respect, is not confirmed by the history either of your own country or of the rest of the world. Mr. Roosevelt continues that it is no answer to the plea for peaceful discussion for one side to plead that unless they receive assurances beforehand that the verdict will be theirs, they will not lay aside their arms. Answer: do you believe, Mr. Roosevelt, that if the ultimate fate of nations is in the balance, a government or the leaders of a people will lay down their arms or surrender them before a conference, simply in the blind hope that the other members of the conference will be wise enough, or rather clear-sighted enough, to reach the right decision? Mr. Roosevelt, there has been only one country and one government which has acted in accordance with the recipe you extol in such glowing terms. And that country was Germany. The German nation, trusting in the solemn assurances of President Wilson and in the confirmation of these assurances by the Allies, once laid down its weapons and went unarmed to the conference table. It is true that as soon as the German nation laid down its arms, there was no question of an invitation to a conference table. But in violation of all assurances, it was made the victim of the worst breach of a promise ever known. Then one day, instead of the greatest confusion known to history being repaired around the conference table, the world's most cruelly dictated treaty brought about a still more fearful confusion. But the representatives of the German nation, who had laid down their arms, trusting in the solemn assurance of an American president, and therefore came unarmed, were not received, even though they came to accept the terms of the dictated treaty. After all, they were the representatives of a nation which at least had held out with infinite heroism against the whole world for 4 years in the struggle for its liberty and independence. They were subjected to even greater degradation than can ever have been inflicted on the chieftains of Sioux tribes. The German delegates were insulted by the mob. Stones were thrown at them, and they were dragged like prisoners, not to the council table of the world, but before the tribunal of the victors. And there, at the pistol's point, they were forced to undergo the most shameful subjection and plundering that the world had ever known. I can assure you, Mr. Roosevelt, that I am steadfastly determined to see to it that not only now, but for all time to come, no German hall ever again enter a conference defenseless, but that at all times and forever, every representative of Germany must and shall have behind him the united strength of the German nation. So help me God. The President of the United States believes that in conference rooms, as in courts, it is necessary that both sides enter in good faith, assuming that substantial justice will accrue to both. Answer: German representatives will never again enter a conference that is for them a tribunal, for who is to be the judge there? At a conference, there is no accused and no prosecutor, but two contending parties. If their own good sense does not bring about a settlement between the two parties, they will never surrender themselves to the verdict of other powers whose interests are wholly foreign to theirs. Incidentally, the United States herself declined to enter the League of Nations and to become the victim of a court which was able, merely by a majority vote, to give a verdict adverse to individual interests. But I should be much obliged to President Roosevelt if he would explain to the world what the new World Court is to be like. Who are the judges here? According to what procedure are they selected? On what responsibility do they act? And above all, to whom can they be made accountable for their decision? Mr. Roosevelt believes that the cause of world peace would be greatly advanced if the nations of the world were to give a frank statement relating to the present and future policy of their governments. Answer: I have already done this, Mr. Roosevelt, in innumerable public speeches. And in the course of this present meeting of the German Reichstag, I have again, as far as this is possible in the space of 2 hours, made a statement of this kind. I must, however, decline to give such an explanation to anyone else than to the people for whose existence and life I am responsible, and who, in their turn, alone have the right to demand that I account to them. However, I give the aims of the German policy so openly that the entire world can air it in any case. Mr. Roosevelt also stated in conclusion that the heads of all great governments are in this hour responsible for the fate of humanity, and that they cannot fail to hear the prayers of their peoples to be protected from the foreseeable chaos of war. And I too would be held accountable for this. Mr. Roosevelt, I fully understand that the vastness of your nation and the immense wealth of your country allows you to feel responsible for the history of the whole world and for the fate of all peoples. My sphere, Mr. President, is considerably smaller and more modest. You have 130 million people on 9,500,000 square kilometers. You possess a country with enormous riches, all mineral resources, fertile enough to feed 500 million people and to provide them with every necessity. I took over the leadership of a state which was faced by complete ruin thanks to its trust in the promises of the outside world and to the evil government of its own democratic regime. In this state, there are roughly 140 people to each square kilometer, not 15 as in America. The fertility of our country cannot be compared with that of yours. We lack numerous minerals which nature has bestowed on you in unlimited quantities. Billions of German savings accumulated in gold and foreign exchange during many years of peace were extorted from us. We lost our colonies. In 1933, one had in my country 7 million unemployed, a few million part-time workers, millions of impoverished peasants, trade destroyed, commerce ruined. In short, general chaos. Since then, Mr. Roosevelt, I have only been able to fulfill one single task. I cannot feel myself responsible for the fate of a world. For this world took no interest in the pitiful fate of my own people. I have regarded myself as called upon by Providence to serve my own people alone and to deliver them from their frightful misery. Thus, for the past 6.5 years, I have lived day and night for the single task of awakening the powers of my people in face of our desertion by the rest of the world, of developing these powers to the utmost and of utilizing them for the salvation of our community. I have conquered chaos in Germany, re-established order, immensely increased production in all branches of our national economy, by strenuous efforts produced substitutes for numerous materials which we lack, prepared the way for new inventions, developed transportation, caused magnificent roads to be built, and canals to be dug, created gigantic new factories. I have striven no less to translate into practice the ideal behind the thought, community, and to promote the education and culture of my people. I have succeeded in finding useful work once more for all the 7 million unemployed who are so close to our hearts, in keeping the German peasant on his soil in spite of all difficulties and in saving it for him, in causing German trade to flourish once again, and in promoting transportation to the utmost. To protect them against the threats of the outside world, I have not only united the German people politically, but also rearmed them. I have likewise endeavored to rid them of that treaty, page by page, which in its 448 articles contains the vilest oppression which has ever been inflicted on men and nations. I have brought back to the Reich the provinces stolen from us in 1919. I have led back to their native country millions of Germans who were torn away from us and were in abject misery. I have reunited the territories that have been German throughout 1,000 years of history. And Mr. Roosevelt, I have endeavored to attain all this without bloodshed and without bringing to my people, and so to others, the misery of war. This I have done, Mr. Roosevelt, though 21 years ago I was an unknown worker and soldier of my people by my own energy, and can therefore claim a place in history among those men who have done the utmost that can be fairly and justly demanded from a single individual. You, Mr. Roosevelt, have an immeasurably easier task in comparison. You became President of the United States in 1933 when I became Chancellor of the Reich. Thus, from the very outset, you became head of one of the largest and wealthiest states in the world. It is your good fortune to have to sustain scarcely 15 people per square kilometer in your country. At your disposal are the most abundant natural resources in the world. Your country is so vast and your fields so fertile that you can ensure for each individual American at least 10 times more of the good things of life than is possible in Germany. Nature, at least, has given you the opportunity to do this. Although the population of your country is scarcely 1/3 larger than that of Greater Germany, you have more than 15 times as much room. And so you have time and leisure on the same huge scale as you have everything else to devote your attention to universal problems. Consequently, the world is undoubtedly so small for you that you perhaps believe that your intervention can be valuable and effective everywhere. In this way, therefore, your concern and your suggestions cover a much larger and wider field than mine. For my world, Mr. President, is the one to which Providence has assigned me and for which it is my duty to work. Its area is much smaller. It comprises my people alone. But I believe I can thus best serve that which is in the hearts of all of us: justice, well-being, progress, and peace for the whole community of mankind. Führer Adolf Hitler